Our song is your song.
Your friends on 539.
We care about you.
On Sunshine Radio. Sunshine Radio.
In December 1988, the Irish government introduced a new Wireless Telegraphy Act. The Act significantly increased the penalties for pirate radio broadcasting in Ireland. For a decade previous, pirate radio dominated the airways in Ireland, with stations like Treble TR, Radio Nova, Sunshine Radio and Heartbeat. The pirate era also produced some great broadcasting personalities, many of whom are still on the air on both radio and television today. People like Marty Whelan, Brian Dobson, Mark Cagney, Aidan Cooney and Robbie Irwin. In this six-part series for DCTV, we are going to meet the men and women who are on the air broadcasting on the many pirate radio stations in the city. These men and women were on air at midnight on December 31st, 1988, when the curtain came down on a broadcasting revolution. These are Dublin's pirate radio days.
Our song is your song.
Your friends on 539.
We care about you.
On Sunshine Radio. Sunshine Radio.
We care about.
25 years ago, the Irish government of the day introduced the 1988 Wireless Telegraphy Act, with the intention of closing the multitude of pirate radio stations that dominated the Irish broadcasting landscape. By 1988, almost 200 radio stations were on the air across the country in cities, towns and villages. Allied with the punitive legislation was the creation of the Independent Radio and Television Commission to license legal independent commercial radio and television, breaking RTE's 60-year monopoly. Today we hear from two broadcasters who have a unique insight into those pirate radio days. As this series is talking about Dublin Pirate Days, I'd like to just take a moment to remember one of the greats of Irish pirate broadcasting, Bob Gallico. He was one of the great broadcasters with Radio Nova, doing Declan Meehan's Brecky Wacky Trekkie programme in the mornings. Sad loss to the industry, and our condolences go out to his family. I'm joined today by Mike Purcell, who was with Dublin South Community Radio. I'd like to welcome Mike to the show. Mike, just tell us, how did you get involved in pirate radio?
Well, around 1985, my other half was looking over the top of the paper and she said, "You're interested in tape and all that sort of stuff. There's a thing about local radio you should go along to." So I went along to it, and there was a meeting addressed by Jack Byrne of the NACB at the time, who I didn't know at all. But he enthused everybody about local radio. Now, at that stage, the people who were interested in local radio were a residents' association. Now, they didn't actually really light my fire. But I was into sound and audio and all that sort of stuff, recording for years. So I said, local radio, this is the place I want to be. So 27 years later, I'm still in local radio. I'm still fixing headphones and leads and microphones, and I should have better sense. I should go home.
And what was the first station you worked with?
Well, the first and only station I worked with was Dublin South FM, but at that time it was called DSCR, Dublin South Community Radio. And we started off up a little lane opposite the old shopping centre in Dundrum, if anybody knows it. And there's a crowd there who are into local business and so on like that. They gave us a few bob, covered the price of our first transmitter, and we started off with one room in there. And
went on from there.
It went on from there.
And
we built 5 studios in a row.
And you were still on air in 1988 when the new laws came in?
We were.
And
but of course, you see, the thing about that was we were a community group. So rather than pirates with the Jolly Roger and all that, there were plenty of them around. Of course, every weekend there was a new one on. And you could hear people, kids were doing it from their bedrooms and so on and so forth. But we had to stay squeaky clean because of the community aspect, because we were trying to get money from local community groups and so on and so forth. So we actually met with the politicians And we more or less said, we're starting off to get experience, but after a little while, when the thing becomes illegal, as it really was, when the new act will come in, we will stop broadcasting.
And did you stay broadcasting right up to December 88?
Up to December 88.
And what was the last broadcast like? How did it feel?
It felt as if we were on the edge of something brilliant. And of course, what happened? Everything went downhill for 5 years.
Full stop.
Because the IRTC, the Independent Radio and Television Commission, in their wisdom, said that they weren't going to issue licenses for community radio. Now, we got a series of, I remember at one stage with a photocopier copying the letters that we got from the IRTC, and to say that the reasons were inscrutable is charitable. They were making them up as they went along. Justice Henchy would not issue the licence. Now, I sort of have a funny idea in my mind why that might be, because AMARC, which is an international community radio group, held a function in UCD hosted by Jack Byrne. And it was brilliant. It showed that community radio was all around the world, but we have the luxury of being in a democracy. In a lot of these countries, democracy was only an idea. So therefore, local radio, community radio, was used as a sort of revolutionary device. And Justice Henchy came in. I remember seeing them at the back of the room, looking at all these guys. So there's sort of a slightly pink-red whiff off them. Using radio for revolutionary purposes, which is nothing wasn't going to happen in Ireland. But I think he thought, Red's under the bed. No way on my watch am I going to give licence to this shower.
So you were left waiting.
We were left waiting. Embarrassment wasn't in it, because we'd gathered money from a whole lot of people. And we had built studios. We had built, at this stage, we'd moved from the little small pokey place in the back of Dundrum, where if you wanted to wash your hands, you went out into the black night, you felt your way along the wall until you got the tap, you washed your hands, and you wiped them on your shirt, and you came back into the one room that we had. But anyway, at this stage, we had convinced the local PP that we were good people, and he gave us one room in Holy Cross School. And we went in there, and we were thrilled. We subdivided into studios and all, and we were absolutely thrilled. And we were ready to go.
And how, you waited 5 years before you could get a licence?
Well, 5 years. And you've no idea the fact that we had studios built, we had a community group ready to go, we had got money from people, we couldn't look anybody in the eye. They said, where's the money? When are you going on air? We gave you the money. Everybody bought shares. I sold shares to the fellas I worked with. And every so often, they used to come and say, when's our dividend? Hop in the ball.
Did they when you got the station up and running then, did it feel like a brand new event to get a new station, or did you feel, or was it just, we waited 5 years, we've continued on from the pirate days?
Well, I will say that we spent 5 frustrating years. We met once a month, every month for 5 years, and that takes some going. That's what I call stamina with a capital S.
Were you ever tempted quietly to go back on the air?
Yes. And I also remember ringing up the IRTC and saying to some official, we are a community. You can't switch us off like a tap. We are here. It's your job to give us the licence. Mutter, toil and trouble, etc., etc. On the final day, anyway. Well, can I just make, there was a little bit of a misadventure, because we had built our new studios in Holy Cross School, ready to go, and what happened? The school board said, oh, you can't broadcast from here. And we thought, no premises equals no licence.
Yeah.
So, but one of our guys was used to walking on water, so he went down to Aidan Stanley, who was the owner of the old Pie Centre, which was in Dundrum, which used to make radios during the war.
Opposite the Eagle House pub, isn't it?
Opposite the Eagle House, exactly. You have it in one. So anyway, in there, that's where they used to make radios in the old days, in the emergency and so on and so forth. Anyway, we went into him. The offices were all vacant, and to his undying credit, he gave us the top floor of the old Pie offices. So for the third time, we built studios, built them in, put in the equipment, wired them up, got them going, and we got an aerial up on top. And on the day it opened, it was marvellous. Somebody came from the IRTC, smile. All the people who had been giving us money over the years, a few bob here and there and stuff like that, we felt as if we had finally arrived. We were the first community station to go on air in Dublin.
Very good. And still on air?
We're still on air, yes.
And where can we find you?
93.9.
Very good. What would you say, Mike, would be the lasting legacy of pirate radio? from the 80s?
Pirate radio.
Not just from a community point of
Oh
view.
no, I'm just
like
talking.
the 80s.
I'm a consumer of
Yeah.
of pirate radio.
That's what. Yeah, exactly.
The thing about pirate radio is, forever it changed the character of Irish radio. For years and years and years, our betters had told us what they thought we should listen to. Suddenly, out came the licenses. Various stations got licenses. It was our radio. It wasn't their radio.
Yeah.
We had turned the corner. The politicians, I think, were afraid. If you give these guys a microphone, they'll shout sedition in. They'll all march on the Dáil and burn it down.
What would it?
Not a bad idea.
Not a bad idea. Probably an idea that might be still around today. But
Yes.
In those pirate days, what would you have listened to? What
I
stations
listened
would you
to
like?
Big D, ARD, Radio Dublin, and of course the magic sounds of Eamon Cook. There's a whole lot of guys. If I can remember. Oh yes, Chris Carey, Dr. Don, Sybil Fennell, Bob Gallico, recently
Deceased, yeah.
expired, and a beautiful voice. He had Bob Gallico had a lovely voice. He was probably the best voice among a lot of them. But all of these names, these people were like the sort of the 12 apostles to us.
gods.
And you go around past the place in the back of where was it? Big D was Christchurch, Chapel Lane. You pass by, and the door was about 3 feet above the ground, and you pass by and say, "There's radio going on in there."
Different era.
It was like Christchurch Cathedral for us, and we listened to these guys, and of course there was so much infighting was going on, and this, that,
I'd
and
be
the other.
listening to something illegal and
Something illegal.
underground.
And then you'd hear, Captain Cook, his aerial is painted green and it's up a tree, up the mountain. Why? Because the other pirates are gone and they were stealing the aerials. And there was all sorts of stories.
There was all kinds of
Guys
stories
going over to Galway to try and get their aerial, they'd put crisscross and they'd get the exact spot of the transmitter and go back and take their aerial back. It was brilliant stuff.
Well, thanks very much, Mike, for coming in.
You're very
to hear
welcome
the stories.
indeed.
Great to hear the stories from the early 80s and the late 80s. And I wish you continued success with Dublin South Community Radio.
Thank you very much indeed. It's really been a pleasure.
All right, thank you. For decades, Irish broadcasting legislation was dominated by the 1926 Wireless Telegraphy Act. The first prosecution under the Act was that of Michael Madden, who was convicted in 1935 of operating the city broadcasting station CBS in Limerick. The legislation was used for the next 60 years to control the airwaves until the late 1970s, when a loophole was discovered in the law. Now no longer fit for purpose, stations exploited the vacuum created by political instability. Pirate radio flourished, with many of today's household names on radio and television getting their first break on pirate radio. As we recorded this series of Dublin Pirate Days in the DCTV studios, perhaps it's timely just to have a quick look back at the history of community television in Dublin and pirate television in Dublin. Community television has its roots in the 1970s, when the then Minister for Post and Telegraphs, Conor Cruz O'Brien, initiated a community scheme initially in Ballyfermot Community Television, and then to Tala, and then to Harold's Cross. This experiment was carried on the cable system Phoenix Relays, but only lasted a short while as RTE complained. Ballyfermot stayed on air shortly afterwards as a pirate television channel, but slowly went off air. The first true effort at pirate television was Channel D, originally known as Channel 3. It began broadcasting in 1981, initially from the Camelot Hotel in Malahide, but then moving to the State Cinema in Phibsborough. The station carried basically VHS programmes, some made in studio like Weekend Dublin with an interviewer called Brian Dick, and interviews with the then just a councillor, Mary Harney. She later went on to be Taoiseach. The station stayed on air for about 9 months until a transmitter fire closed the station in late 1981. There were a couple of other smaller attempts at putting pirate television on air in the 1980s. Eamon Cook at Radio Dublin put a test card on, while Capital Radio put a clock on air. Outside Dublin in Drogheda, County Louth, Boyneside Television went on air in November 1981. They stayed on air until April 1982. The first serious attempt at pirate television in Dublin was Radio Nova, who decided to put a pirate television on air in December 1983. Chris Carey, who had set up the successful Radio Nova and had taken huge amount of ratings from RTE, decided the new way was for television. He had got himself a pirate television transmitter, good quality signal, and put the station on air in early December 1983. He planned breakfast television, and he also planned to sponsor programmes. This really rankled the government, and within a week the station was raided and closed. One of the more famous pirate television broadcasters, although located outside Dublin, was Danjo Kelleher, who actually had his own RTE radio documentary made on his station, LTV, which was located in Macroom, County Cork. It went on air in 1984 and stayed on air until 1988, when it closed in accordance with the Wireless Telegraphy Act of 1988. The station was replaced some years later by LTV2, operating from Mill Street, and by Sean Radley. In fact, and if you look on the internet today, you will still find LTV2 still on air. One of the more political pirate television channels was Television na Gaeltachta, a platform where enthusiasts tried to encourage the government to set up an all-Irish language channel. The station operated in 1988 in Rossmuck in County Galway. It eventually led to the formation of TG4. RLO TV in Limerick was an offshoot of RLO Radio. Radio Limerick 1 originally had the franchise for the Limerick area from the IRTC, but lost the franchise, but remained on air as both a pirate radio station and a pirate television station. One of the smaller pirate television stations in Ireland was BBC, which operated for the local community festival in Ballinamore, County Leitrim, from August 2000 until 2003. Pirate television is now long gone, and community television is small but effective across the country. In Dublin we have DCTV, in Cork, Cork Community Television, in Navan there's P5 TV, and in Belfast, NVTV.
Our song is your song.
Your friends on 539.
We care about you.
On Sunshine Radio.
Radio Nova. The music's just begun. Radio Nova, Europe's #1.
Radio Nova. The music's just begun.
Radio Nova, Europe's #1.
In pirate radio in Dublin in the 1970s, many of the stations were named after the operators' girlfriends. So you had stations like Radio Cleo, Radio Veronica and Radio Corinna. It was often the case that the girlfriend really only knew she became the ex-girlfriend when the station changed names. In the 1980s, a new wave of broadcasting came in, American style, so stations reflected this by being known as Q95, KELO and KLAS. This trend still remains today with the stations like 98 FM and FM 104. In the history of broadcasting, radio has been an integral part of the industry. But one of the few problems in the industry was the gender balance. And it's often the case, and still is today, that women find it hard to struggle within the radio circles. But back in the 70s and 80s it was even harder. But I have in my studio today a guest who broke the mould, as it were, in the 1970s and 80s. I'd like to welcome Tracy Evans to the show. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Eddie.
How did you get involved in pirate radio?
Well, it's a strange story because in 1978 my husband died and was very young, as you can imagine. I'm still going strong now, but I had 6 children under 12. I just had a baby and she was only 6 months. So, like Joe and myself used to watch a lot of telly. We loved telly and all the iClaudius, all this, the great series. So they went to bed early because they were still young. So I'd be sitting there and watching the telly on my own, and I'd turn over and I'd be looking for Joe. I'd say something to him and I'd get very upset, and I said, well, this can't go on. So I gave up the telly and started listening to the radio. So I was absolutely amazed because with 6 children I had no chance to listen in general too much, except for a bit of music.
Yeah.
So I discovered that there was such an array of stations, and when I heard some of them I said, I think I could do better than this.
Very good, yes.
You know, I think I'd be good here. So I got myself into, we called it the playroom where the kids played. We had a radiogram, and I taped from the radiogram to a cassette, and they were looking for people in Radio City. So I sent it in, and in a few days' time I got called, and I started on the 1st of December 1980
Jeez,
So,
well remembered.
just like that.
And that was Radio City down in Capel Street.
That was, Tony O'Hara was managing it
And
at
what
the
kind
time.
of show would you have?
I did an hour first, and the very first time I went in on air, I put my mic up and I put it back down again. And I said,
Panic.
I'm not having this. But then I got used to it. I used to bring my little child, she was only 2.5, in with me, sit her there drawing. And I'd always had a kind of a bit of a magazine. I'd do bits and pieces, household hints and thought for the day and bit of astrology, all of like a magazine program for an hour.
And I know your show got quite popular. You had a good listenership.
I was very lucky then. Radio Dublin came looking for me, and I didn't go at first, but then I decided I'd stretch my wings, I'd go. So
Radio Dublin being a bigger station at
yeah,
the
well,
time.
it had a big
Bigger following,
listenership,
yeah.
it definitely had. So I got 2 hours over there,
Up in
10 to
Inchicore.
12, yes. So, or 12 to 2, I don't know, I'd vary sometimes from 10 to 12 to 12 to 2. 12 to 2 is my normal show. So
And did you like Radio Dublin?
I loved Radio Dublin. I loved the. I was left alone completely to do whatever I wanted to do. Nobody was really interfering.
Did no
So,
producer
and
over your shoulder?
I'd never done radio before in my life, so it was very new to me. But to be able to do whatever you wanted was absolutely great.
Freehand.
Yeah, although sometimes we used to have so many ads, you'd hardly hear me in between the ads. I used to hate that time of the year.
Unfortunately, that's where money was being
I know.
made. And after Radio Dublin, where did you head to?
Well, I think this is in 1982. I got the first countdown to local radio.
I remember well,
picked.
yes.
Yeah, I was very, very lucky to be picked on that. And we were in Foss out in Anco, as it was called then, out in Finglas
Yeah.
for 6 months. But at the end of that, there was no sign of any stations anywhere. Nobody was ready.
No.
So I said, well, for my time at that, I was in my 40s then, and there was no point in hanging around. So I said, I'd go back to Radio Dublin, which was probably frowned on at the time. But I don't believe in
No, gotta
like
move on.
whatever I want to do
Gotta move
myself.
on, yeah.
So I stayed in Radio Dublin for a year or so, and then I moved on to Liberty Radio, which was in the Liberties.
Yeah, Mr. Prendergast.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, and then I think I briefly went back to Radio Dublin again. I was forever hopping backwards and forwards because they let me come back anytime I liked.
Change is always good.
I know.
Keeps you
Being a
keeps you fresh.
Gemini, I always on the move. So the Radio Dublin then really went well. We had Jessica Matthews. I was studying astrology in Rathmines at the time, and I got her to come in with me. And we had an absolute marvellous show on a Friday. But on my show we did astrology. Everybody phoned in, everybody asked.
And this was a new idea.
This was great. Even Father Cleary's Phyllis used to be on touch with us the whole time and everything. Father Cleary used to come in on my show on a Good Friday and sit with me doing my show on a Good Friday.
Before it all blew up.
Yes. So anyway, then I suppose I decided I always like romantic music. I still play it today. So off I go then to Heartbeat,
With Tony
because
O'Hara.
Tony O'Hara had started. I went to him first, and then he had the station in Dolphin's Barn, which was absolutely brilliant, and a big following.
Yeah.
'Cause I remember talking to Jerry Ryan on the stage one day. We were getting awards for something or another, and he said, you know, my wife listens to Heartbeat, he listens to your station. So that
Was a
was
great
a
pat on the
boost.
back.
Yeah,
Absolutely, yeah.
Seeing he was from RTE.
Yes, actually, yeah.
Yeah,
Done on the quiet.
exactly.
And you were at Heartbeat when the stations came to an end in
I was in
December
1988.
1988.
Yeah, the second last hour I did. I
From
had
10 to 11.
Yes.
What was it? What was the feeling like?
It was, I felt it very sad because I knew we were definitely closing down, and like there was so much rumblings for many years about the Pirates being put off the air, and they were closed down, as you know, now and again.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I said I'll have to try something new, which I did. But that was the end of radio for me for a while. But I did a bit of hospital radio, and actually in the summers when I'd when I'd have a bit of time, I'd go around stations and that,
Make
like yourself, and
investigators.
find, yes.
What was the last song you played? Do you remember?
Gosh, I can't remember that,
No.
Eddie. Would you believe that? I can't remember that. It was so, I suppose.
Do you think it's underestimated the legacy that the Pirates left? That they're not getting the recognition for creating radio listenership and creating some of the stars that are still on the air today.
Oh, there is. I know
Yeah.
a lot of the lads that are on all of the stations today, they're still there. Yeah, I suppose 25 years, as you said yourself, I couldn't believe that when you told me that. I suppose anytime you do mention the Pirates, so anytime I've ever mentioned the Pirates, everybody has a good word to say about them.
It's good nostalgia.
Actually, my father hated me being on the radio because of my age and because of the 6 children. And then suddenly,
It was illegal.
It was illegal. But suddenly, then, because I had the listenership, he was proud of me, which I couldn't believe.
And what was your best moment in radio? In pirate radio?
In pirate radio. Well, I think in 1987, when I did a lot of work for the Irish Wheelchair Association, Harry Ellis was running it then, and I was at all their fund raisers and that, and suddenly then they threw a night for me in the Belgard Inn. They threw a tribute night.
Lovely.
And they had some stars that came along and did, and I hosted it, and it was a real proud
Much
moment.
deserved. Well done.
It really was.
Yeah. And I haven't asked you your best moment. What was your worst moment?
I think my worst moment was
You
I was on Radio Dublin at the time and sitting, enjoying my show, I had it actually Tony Allen did all my jingles. I had great jingles for the dreams and yes.
The voice.
He did all for my health and beauty and for my dreams lot and for astrology. And here I was enjoying it, and the next minute guy came into the station. Maybe we won't name him, but he was having a dispute with the captain,
the station owner, Eamon Cook, at the time.
And he said, "I'm sorry, Tracy, but I'm not talking to Eamon at the moment, and I have to take the decks." So
right from under you.
Right from under, he took both decks, and I was left with my.
Deckless?
At least I had a deckless, but at least I had the
the cassette players.
They changed so much in those years. They were changing.
The old pop-in cassettes.
Yes.
And what are you up to now?
I'm on Liffey Sound, 96.4 FM. We're based in
Doing what you do best.
And I love it. I do a show between 12 and 2 on a Saturday, and still the same type of magazine, health and beauty, astrology, and
you
people are still fed up, I'm sure. No, at my age, but it keeps me young, I feel, and I say to my grandchildren, "Do you think I should give it up?" No, why should you?
No, why not? Well, Tracy, it's been an absolute pleasure. I thank you very much for coming in. And one of the great names in Irish radio, Tracy Evans.
Thank you very much, Eddie.
The first of the new commercial independent radio stations, launched after the close down in 1988, was Capital Radio, which went on the air on July 20th, 1989. The first voice heard on air was Scott Williams, while the first tune played was Phil Lynnett's Old Town. This station is known today as FM 104. My guest is Martin Block, who is going to tell us a little bit about what it was like in December 1988 while he was at Q. Martin, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much indeed.
Firstly, just to go back a little bit before that, how did you get involved in pirate radio?
A long story, try and make it short. I was working my father's business, which closed down, and I was doing nothing. And a very good friend of mine said to me, "You've got a good voice, make up a tape." So I made up a demo tape, and I sent it to all the various different people, in those days, RTE and Sunshine and Nova. And I got a phone call out of the blue from Robbie Robinson, and he said to me, "Please come in here Monday morning to my offices." So I went up to the offices in, I think it was Baggot Street.
Baggot Street, above JWT.
Exactly. I went up there, and he handed me an Irish Times newspaper, and he said to me, "Read this." And I read the front page of the newspaper. I thought I read it without any mistakes, but I probably did make mistakes. And he just turned around to me and said, "Fantastic." He said, "You start reading the news midnight to 6 on Saturday night." And that's actually how I got the job.
Straight in.
So I got a job working as a newsreader, and I did a number of months working, reading news, learning all the preparatory stuff that you did for assembling the news. Read it through the night, to be brutally honest with you, I don't think many people heard me.
With no real training.
With no real training.
Learning
I
on the
learned
fly,
on
on the
the
fly,
spot.
yeah.
And what we did, and of course this was the great environment of those days, you learned from other people around you.
Yeah.
And everybody else was happy to sort of give information and help.
Sharing and caring.
And within about 3 or 4 months, I was actually reading news in the breakfast show on Sunshine with Kathy Cregan.
Great start.
And from there, went to Nova and was a newsreader, part-time newsreader for a good number of years, then a bit more full-time with Nova. And I got a lucky break through Pierre Doyle, who ran Q102 around about 1984. And Lawrence John was the program director. And I came in as a sort of a manager. And eventually, Mike Hogan, who was in Radio Nova at that stage.
Probably more famous as the Q102 Eye in the Sky.
Absolutely. And,
For those old enough to remember.
Correct. And of course, the funny story about that is that we went out and we got him a Biggles outfit. We had him with this big, huge scarf with a coat hanger.
With the goggles.
And we used to go and we used to do a lot about OBs, and he'd be there in Switzer's window.
And no bother to him.
Oh, well, he was brilliant. He
Yeah.
was brilliant. I mean, and of course, I mean, Mike's role in Q102 was very much the business side, the money side. I was the PD. And his assistant. We did a huge amount of presentations to the agencies.
And
we were one of the most successful.
Well, it had taken over from Nova by the time that the Pirates had come. It had come be #1 station in Dublin.
Eventually it did, and there were some metamorphoses. We had guys like Bill Cunningham who came in, and he changed it to Super Q midway through that period. And then when he left, it went back to the way it really was. But it was quite interesting. I mean, we learned so much. I mean, anybody who worked in those big pirate radio stations learned from each other. It was working on the job. You learned every facet, though. That was the interesting thing. You learned every facet of the business. You had to be able to present. You had to be able to do news or whatever.
Step in wherever the point was needed.
You even knew a bit about the technical side of things. If you could sell, that was a bonus. So you learned everything. You learned how to edit your own adverts. In fact, actually, there were occasions in the early days where you went out, you sold an ad, you wrote the script, you went into the voiceover booth, you clicked onto the reel-to-reel, you walked inside, you actually read the advert a few times, you went back outside, switched the off button on, started to edit it and put the music to it. And with that, put it onto a cart machine. And you literally had it in the log 5-10 minutes later. So it was an amazing learning process. And I mean, people today, there's still a lot of us now who worked in the Pirates, still working in radio. We got a grounding that nobody else got.
I couldn't get there were no other training grounds as good as it.
No.
It was the legacy of pirate radio, because there's a generation of broadcasters out there now who learned their skills.
That's right.
The hard way.
Completely the hard way. And I mean, the one...
And it'd be almost unfair to call them pirates. I know they were illegal, but
Well,
they were professional broadcasters in their own right.
I mean, some of these people, had worked in Radio Caroline, come from the BBC, worked in ILR radio stations. People like Tom Hardy, people like Tony Allen, for example.
Great Tony Allen.
Who had the most incredible voice.
Yeah.
Bob Gallico. These were people who were professional broadcasters. I mean, we never treated ourselves as pirates. We always felt that we were somewhat towards like independent radio operators, broadcasters, obviously without portfolios.
Quasi-legal.
Because we went, we were unauthorised, so to speak.
And how did you feel? How was the feeling within the station when you knew the legislation was going to come in? Now, not before the closure, which was a different, but when you knew that the point had been reached and it had to close in December '88.
There was a nervousness. A lot of us didn't know what was coming next, how it would be operated, who would be the operators. At that particular time in 1988, or prior to the legislation coming in, people like Robbie Robinson were definite favourites in those days to win a licence. We were unsure whether people like Pierre Doyle, who was the main man behind Q102, or Chris Kerry himself would get a licence. We felt that they had, by being pirates, maybe it was going to go against
slightly,
them. But we weren't aware that there really were other commercial investors, people eventually like Dennis O'Brien. We weren't aware of those. And in fact, we thought that to some extent, the future operators would be people who were broadcasters and not just businessmen. Of course, that's when the whole thing really
When it
changed. So there was a tremendous nervousness. We didn't really know where it was all going to go, where we'd be all working. Some of the guys that I worked with took, I suppose, they tried to sort of hedge their bets. They went to work in Millennium Radio for RTE, thinking that
was the step.
They'll get into RTE. Some of them, of course, remained in RTE, and then when licenses were awarded, went to apply for jobs with the independent operators.
Including the likes of Century, which is not far from the studio.
Yeah, correct.
I want to take it then to the last hour of Q, if that's possible. And this is where I really want to find out what, it must have been a sense of, I don't know, loss when it was closing.
It was. What we did
was there excitement in the studio?
Oh, when there was, there was excitement. I mean, it's quite interesting. In Q102's case, what actually happened was I put a schedule together of all the mainline broadcasters and the sort of part-time broadcasters, the more serious part-time broadcasters, been with us for years, and we all did an hour, including myself, when I hosted the very last hour. So we had Greg Cochran and we had all the various guys, on the air, guys like Jason Main and I can't remember whether Gareth O'Callaghan was with us at that stage. I think he may have been. We had all, Aidan Leonard, guys who, as I say,
everyone got to say their goodbyes.
Everyone got to say their goodbyes. I think John Kenny was with us as well, who's now in sports and RTE.
Names are still there, you see.
Yeah, I mean, just in newsreaders, Brian Jennings was a newsreader. Prior to that, Anne Casson was a newsreader with us. Brian Dobson, of course, was in. So there was all of the main stars today on RTE somehow
were there in '88.
Were there in '88. The last hour, interesting. Literally played some really eclectic music, as far as I can remember. Brought all of the staff in. It was a party atmosphere. We had all the salespeople in, all of the administration people in the studio itself, down there in number 7, Upper Mount Street.
Still with an uncertain future.
We didn't know. We didn't know. I mean, Mike Hogan and myself were committed to writing an application. We didn't know where that was going. Actually, what we had organised was a school of broadcasting, believe it or not, which was going to give us about a sort of a 6 weeks of work. We'd got a number of people, and we'd actually rented out the studio from Pierre
in
Doyle,
Mount Street.
In Mount Street, which he'd said, look, because he wanted to keep the staff on side, thinking that he was going to get the licence.
It was a lovely studio.
It was a magnificent studio, which in fact actually 98 used
afterwards when they went on air.
Couple of years when they went on air. And so we knew we had about 6 weeks' work. Where it was going to go after that, nobody knew. But yeah, it was nervous times, and it was very funny because at the very end, the last hour, the one thing that sticks in my memory was Pierre Doyle came in, and he turned round and he said something like, the Sony shops we were closing down at 6 o'clock, and he turned around and he said, the Sony Ireland had agreed to sponsor another 6 hours of broadcasting, and we were going to continue on. Of which I played the last record and said, no, we're not. And literally let the music fade out, and we pulled the plug.
And Q closed.
And Q closed down.
And what are you doing today?
I'm working around the radio business. I was involved in 4FM. That was the last radio station that I was involved in setting up. I'm working as a consultant, working with a number of people in Ireland and in the UK. Writing, obviously, radio applications still, and more or less troubleshooting in the radio business, trying to offer my expertise in the various different areas, whether they're presentation, strategic areas.
Which you've learned all the way through your
background. And in fact, that's really where my grounding was.
And what is the Pirates' legacy?
Great fun, revolutionary, anti-establishment. There was no question in my mind that when radio became legal, it was never the same.
No.
There was such an excitement going into work on a Monday morning. So many different things, a tremendous sort of atmosphere, camaraderie working in the studios, great fun, fabulous to be on air. And when independent radio came in, the business side of it took over, and it lost that magic.
Yeah.
It lost that creativity. I personally believe that the creative juices used for promos and competitions and all of that fun element to radio was actually lost when independent radio came on air.
Well, it's been fascinating, Martin. I really appreciate you coming in. Martin Block.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Radio Nova, the music's just begun. Radio Nova, Europe's #1.
Radio Nova.
Radio Nova, the music's just begun. Radio Nova, Europe's #1.
Radio Nova. The music's just begun.
Radio Nova, Europe's #1.
The Pirates were a diverse group of broadcasters, catering for all tastes and genre. You had treble TR and country and western music, sunset and dance radio, Jazz FM as in the title, Alice's Restaurant was alternative rock, and the Irish Mix broadcast Irish traditional music. Radio na Gael and Radio na Pobal were early attempts at all Irish language channels, forerunner to today's Radio na Lifa. A pirate version of RTE's mobile radio service was the Community Broadcasting Co-op, which visited local Dublin communities and broadcast for the 2 or 3 weeks of a local festival. So you had stations like Radio Sandymount, Radio Ringsend, Radio Raheny, and Radio Snowflake, which broadcast at Christmas and was a forerunner of today's Christmas FM. I'm joined today by Declan Meehan. Declan is one of the best known pirate radio DJs going back to the very early 70s, and I'm delighted to have him here today in the studio. Declan, I'm genuinely thrilled to have you here today.
Nice to be here, Eddie.
Pirate radio, I know you're associated today with East Coast, but pirate radio is where you started. How did you become involved in pirate radio?
Well, my mother had an interest in radio. She used to have Radio Éireann on and BBC Radio 2, as it was called, the Light programme then. So radio was always in the house. And if ever we were in town, especially around, say, Henry Street, somewhere like that, you'd see personalities from Radio Éireann coming out of the GPO, and she'd always point them out. And she engendered, I suppose, an interest in radio with me. And then it was at an age where I was getting interested in pop music and teen things and rebellion, that sort of stuff. And along comes Radio Caroline on the band, which is on a ship. So I said, on a ship? And the authorities, of course, are not happy about it. That's pretty good. And they're playing pop music all day. That's even better. So that was Radio Caroline. Wanted to listen all the time. Got a transistor radio. I don't know if many people remember those. But you'd have it with you all the time and listen to as many hours as you could outside school to Radio Caroline. So as I got older, I wanted to be on the ship. But unfortunately, I was too young when the station closed down. So that I have to find a ship of my own. Heard a station in Dunleary called Radio Jacqueline. There's a guy on it named David Kelly. That was in the 1960s. And also a guy who lived up the road from where I used to live, Tony Boylan, who had a radio station called Radio Laxey, then Radio Galaxy. And I mean, he used to play operatic records and things like that. But I was sort of thinking, well, if they can do it, I can do it. So other enthusiasts around the same area, like Robbie Irwin, is one. Robbie is on RTE Radio 1 doing sport. And another guy named Ernie Melia, who was a busman. He actually bought the transmitter, sadly passed away a couple of years ago. But we got together and we said, let's have a station of our own. And this was
Just like
Radio Vanessa. And how we came up with the name was, well, all radio stations, like in Holland, Radio Veronica.
Girls' names.
There was Caroline, so it had to be a girl's name. And I must say I was pretty guilty of admiring a young lady named Vanessa, which was a very attractive name, I thought, and the spelling of it was even lovely. So we said, we have to call the station Radio Vanessa. So we did, and we broadcast initially. We recorded the program in either my house or Robbie's, broadcasted from Ernie's house in September of 1970.
Wow.
And that was the start.
And
in 1972, I know you were involved in Melinda.
Yeah, well, there were far more stations then opening up, probably based on, well, if Radio Vanessa can do it, we can do it, and more stations opened up across the city. And we generally knew the people involved from
Same circle.
going over to them or dropping into their houses. But out of the blue, on 300 metres, as they were called at that time, was this radio station called Radio Melinda. And it was a very strong signal. I said, where is this thing coming from? And didn't recognise any of the people who were on it. So the way to track down radio stations at the time, because they were on medium wave, was to take a transistor radio with a ferrite aerial in it, and it'd be very directional.
Yeah.
And you just followed the strongest signal. And one Sunday morning, arrived down into Sean McDermott Street. I'd never been there before, but heard it had bad reputation. Into it anyway, and went into a block of flats there called St. Mary's Mansion, and said, do you know anything about a radio station? And they said, oh yeah, it's Jimmy Lynch. He's over there. See that door over there? So I thought, we could have been post office. Or
anybody, yeah.
So in we went, knocked on the door, and this guy, Jimmy Lynch, answered, and he said, oh right, yeah, you lads, Radio Vanessa, yeah, come on in. So we walked in, and they said, well, we're a bit under pressure today because we've got to go down to Dolphin Discs to get a few records, and we're getting them for free, so we want to go down. Do you want to go on the air? I said, oh, wouldn't mind going on the air. So suddenly I was on Radio Melinda in this building by myself.
Just left to your own devices?
Just left there. So suddenly I was on the team of Radio Melinda. So there'd be Vanessa on one day and Melinda another day.
But Melinda did come across foul of the law in
there was
December,
a particular weekend when there was trouble in the country with an interview that a reporter did in RTE with the Chief of Staff of the IRA. And there was difficulty about revealing sources, and this person was Kevin O'Kelly. And he was brought to court, and because of the sanction that was placed upon him, RTE said, we're going on strike to protest against what's happened to him. And the only radio station then that was left on in Dublin was Radio Melinda. So there's been raids going on with the department. There was a guy named Mr. Callender was in charge, and he was spotted outside different radio stations. However, he was in the vicinity of Radio Melinda on a previous weekend, and I'd said something on the air like, this is the fight for free radio, and we're going to continue, and we will blah, 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 fight till the end or something. So here was RTE on strike, connected with the IRA, a dispute there, and Radio Melinda was on saying they're going to fight everyone. So down comes the Black Mariah, Mr. Callender, loads of Gardaí.
Taken no more.
And in we went, and we were all taken. And one particular inspector actually said, these are only pirate radio enthusiasts, you know, he says, there's nothing sinister about these. We were taken down to Store Street, Garda Station, and subsequently fined £2 by Justice Brannock. Except for one of us, because on the day of the raid, loads of people came down. Ernie Melia from Radio Vanessa just came down to see it. Mark Story, who's still involved, of course, with radio stations. Ken Sheehan and others. They came down to see Radio Melinda, but they were caught up in the raid. But all except Mark were fined £2 for being there.
Jeez. And where did you go into radio after that? You eventually progressed through up to, I know your big time was with Nova.
Well, that's 10 years away. So I don't know if I can maybe bore you for 20 minutes on that one.
Go on, no.
The radio stations went off the air at that time because of the raids. There's no point in doing it. And then there was a guy named Billy from Dalkey said he's going to venture back. He's a technician. And what he did was he built a big transmitter. And he said it should be used on the air. Well, the radio stations went silent apart from the odd broadcast by some people. Yeah. But a technician guy named Billy from Dalkey was able to build big transmitters. And he put the word around that there was basically transmitters for sale if you wanted one. And at that time, Radio Dublin was coming into play. Ken Sheehan had divested his interest. It went to a guy named Prince Terry. Prince Terry threw that into Don Moore, and Don Moore was essentially running Radio Dublin, and Billy could provide a transmitter. He needed a premises because the raids had started again. He linked up with the guy named Eamon Cook. They moved to Inchicore, and Radio Dublin was on the air with a big transmitter.
Powerful.
Powerful indeed it was. It was the biggest thing we'd ever heard.
Same, yeah.
Eventually, Don and Eamon fell out. At that time, parallel to it, Mark Story, David Kelly, and myself had started the alternative to Radio Dublin.
ARD.
Yeah, ARD, in a shed in Drimna, in David's shed. And we used to wait until Radio Dublin went on the air, then we went on the air as ARD. But anyway, Don and Eamon had a dispute. Eamon said, well, the transmitter's in my house, don't come knocking here anymore. Don says, but it's my radio station. Tough, it's in my house. So Don was spurned, had to go, came over to us in Drimna and said, I've a premises in Cabra. Do you want to make ARD bigger and better? I'll get a transmitter from Billy and we'll have 2 stations on. So that's when it reignited really with ARD and Big D with 2 big transmitters. And that was probably 77, Christmas 77.
And that's when they started really started to introduce schedules and a bit more consistent programming and the longer hours. It went from just occasional broadcasts, we'd be on all weekend.
It attracted different people. It attracted journalists. I mean, Gene Kerrigan was there, for example. When you think, what was Gene Kerrigan doing in a pirate station? Yeah, he was involved in news element and editorial. And ARD saw itself as a radio station to be on the lines of the commercial stations in Britain, where they used to provide a full service. Minority programs, discussion programs, as well as music programs.
News and
whereas
current
Radio
affairs.
Dublin was basically pop music and requests. So there were 2 separate things. But ARD had the eye on getting ultimately the license for Dublin City,
they had
based on their programming.
They got Bernard Llewellyn involved.
Bernard
He
was
brought in some
involved,
money,
with the money.
Yeah. And they eventually they moved to Crofton Airport Hotel from Belvedere Place.
I don't think they used the name ARD, did they? They
was,
used Radio 257.
Yeah,
there was all sorts of changes of ownership or whatever.
And then, of course, in the 80s, the 2 big names arrived. Robbie Robinson and Chris Carey arrived in the city, which was another revolution.
Well, what happened was 2FM started. So there were 5 of us plucked from the Pirates to go on to this new fledgling radio station. Coming at you with Billy Wall, I think, came up with that. There was Marty Whelan, Dave Fanning, Jerry Ryan, Ronan Collins and myself. We were all out of the Pirates now into RT.
Well trained.
Yeah, except that RT wasn't what we thought it was going to be, a pop music station. On the first morning, they asked me to play Brendan Shine, You Want Your Old Lobby Washed Out. And I said, I don't think the Big D audience now is going to be interested.
Which you were hoping that you'd bring to the station.
Oh, gee. So it needed a period of settling down. Anyway, the radio stations went on, continued on, 2FM continued on. 2FM were very annoyed that there was no closure of the Pirates, that they didn't have an open field. But anyway, it was let to continue. There was a guy who had moved to Ireland from Radio North Sea, Brian McKenzie. He ran a production studio
in Herbert Street,
where he had contact with his own old radio buddies. People like Tony Allen arrived over. And also Chris Carey and Robbie Robinson, who'd heard about this mad situation in Ireland where you could go on the air and do what you like.
The loophole had been found in law. And
that's right. So they said, let's start up a radio station, which they did, called Sunshine, in Portmarnock. It was related to a previous venture called Sunshine, which was supposed to be on a ship. But anyway, Sunshine ended up in Portmarnock, and it was Chris and Robbie running it. Now, these were turbulent times, and what happened was that somebody, inverted commas, cut down the aerial.
Yeah.
So Chris Carey immediately says, I'm a Brit. Yeah, so the IRA, they're looking for me. Oh, I'm out of here. So he sold his shares for nothing really to Robbie Robinson. Robbie says, oh, I'm here for the long haul. I don't think it was the IRA. I'm going to continue. Oh, do what you like, do what you like. So Chris hightailed it back to England. Then started to creep back in when he saw, oh,
They're still there.
Robbie's still there. But anyway, I wasn't happy with Sunshine. It was on medium wave and all that. I've heard this station in Los Angeles called Kiss FM. I am going to bring Kiss FM Los Angeles to Dublin. And so was the birth of Radio Nova.
Yeah, it was a revolution in Irish broadcasting. Okay, it's the style of programming that came in, hadn't been heard before. The crisp, clear, what is it, clutter-free sound they used to call it?
Yeah, well, Chris wanted a professional radio station, and I mean, when you look at the people who are on the station, the majority are still in broadcasting today.
Yeah, you get them to start.
Well, Ken Hammond is retired, but Brian Dobson did news, and Casson does, I think, nationwide there. David Harvey was on it, Greg Cochran is on the new Nova.
Yeah.
And you go through the list, and everybody, Colin Hayes is on 2FM, that
John
Chris
Clark
certainly picked his people to go on, and he had this format. When I moved over from Sunshine, he said, you're not going on the air yet. And I said, well, why not? And he says, because you and your girlfriend are going to be flown off, like the TV, flown off to Los Angeles to go to my condominium outside Los Angeles and sit in a jacuzzi. And I said, geez, that sounds great, Chris. So why am I doing that? And he says, you're working. Doing what? You're listening to Kiss FM Los Angeles and you're pretending you're on it. So I was there for 10 days with just a radio station.
Fact-finding mission.
Well, to absorb
what he wanted.
the sound of the radio station. So back to Nova anyway, and we were all sent out. It was a great holiday.
It was a great way to get a signing on fee.
Yeah, you sort of say, there's your tickets, there's a few quid to spend, there's the keys of the condominium, there's the key of the car, go off there and enjoy yourself. It was brilliant, wasn't it?
And Nova was a success, especially in the early years, it was a success. It must have been a great place to work in.
There was never a dull moment in it.
Even with the
raids. Great
raids.
fun. Yeah, that was later on, but it was just great fun, and there seemed to be a huge audience. So you'd only have to say something on the air, and we've no milk today or something, and people would be down with milk, that sort of stuff. It was a very popular station.
Yeah, and after Nova, you moved on to...
Yeah, after the raids happened and Radio Nova was allowed to continue, the government said there's too much unemployment with young people, they're marching on the streets. What are we talking about here? A pop music station?
Yeah,
put it back on, just keep all those kids quiet,
this was
otherwise they'll
83.
riot. Yeah, and there's lots of unemployment and emigration, similar to now. But when RTE saw that the government had said to Nova, you continue, they said, we can't handle this. RTE were no use at combating Radio Nova. They couldn't do it in programming. They couldn't beat them. So the only way to do it was to put on a transmitter against Radio Nova and jam it.
Yeah.
Right? So it was very effective. They were very good at that, the engineering department there in RTE. Anyhow, Chris Carey had a fit. Obviously, he says, they're going to ruin me. They're going to ruin my revenue. So he used to have journalistic programs and talk programs in the evening, 7 to 8 or something like that. And he says, the journalists are all part of the NUJ, and their mates in the NUJ in RTE are putting us out of work. So we fired everybody in the NUJ.
That was Jenny McGeever.
Jenny McGeever and other people who were involved there. And then there was a picket outside the radio station and a strike.
Park.
And it sort of limped on for a while, but I certainly wasn't happy because these were our friends. These were part of the team that had, say, battled against
the station, really, yeah.
And they were outside. So the opportunity came for me to go to London. So I went over to London.
Declan, having worked with pirate radio stations from 1970 through various guises and various professionalism, what would you say is the legacy the pirates have left to today's broadcasters?
Probably the people involved still in broadcasting passing on their knowledge. It's hard to think so many years later that there's any true legacy of the people who are on radio today. They mightn't even been born at the time Nova was there. But I think Nova probably, and the other radio stations, pushed the boat out so much that there had to be independent station. The idea was initially that there would be some sort of RTE local radio network.
That was,
and I think the Labour Party were
Pat
pushing
Roberts
so
celeb at one stage.
they never wanted anything to do with commercial enterprise when it was in radio. It was keep it under government control, and I think that the pirate radio stations ended that notion. So they knew eventually they would have to legislate for radio stations. They took the model of local radio stations and, you know, bigger high-powered radio stations. They did build into the legislation, though, 20% news and current affairs as a safeguard.
And you're still on the air after all these years.
Yeah,
you're out in the East Coast. You're there. You're there how long now?
I joined East Coast in September 1994. Went for 3 weeks to do talk radio. I'd previously been in FM 104 playing quite a lot of the same songs every day, the fresh new music mix, etc. And I was getting a bit older, and I thought, I really could do something else maybe. So for 3 weeks, I went into East Coast to fill in. I think Adrian Kennedy had just gone. And I stayed there, and it's 20 years next year.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Milestone.
I still missed the radio, doing records, remember them? Playing music on the air.
Bit of vinyl.
And I was lucky enough to get the opportunity then to work weekends on Radio Ireland. John McColgan rang me when I was in a supermarket one day. He said, "Do you want to be a star? Come on to Radio Ireland." So I joined that, and that was in 97. So that is 16 years ago. And I'm still with Radio Ireland, which is now Stay FM at the weekends. But I used to do 2 programs, but 7 days a week was pretty demanding. It's just the one in Today FM now.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. You are, when I was listening to radio, one of the heroes listening to radio, one of the great voices, and it was an absolute pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, Declan Meehan.
Radio Nova, the music's just begun. Radio Nova, Europe's #1.
Radio Nova.
Aidan Leonard.
Q102.
Non-stop music on Solid Gold Saturday.
Q102. Your music. Q102. Your music all weekend long. Q102.
As I researched this series, one name kept coming up, that of the late great Tony Allen. Tony was born in the UK and from the late 1960s worked on a number of offshore pirate radio stations, including Radio Scotland, Radio Caroline and Radio North Sea International. In 1979 he moved to Dublin and worked on stations like Big D, Sunshine Radio and Radio Nova. He was famous for his closed-down broadcast of Radio Nova after the 1983 raids. Tony was well respected within the business. He was loved by listeners and liked by those who worked with him. Tony passed away aged 54 in 2004. He was sadly missed and one of the few men whose legacy will live on the airwaves. Hi and welcome. This is another of the Dublin Pirate Radio Days interviews, today with Valerie Coffey, who's going to tell me some of the great stories about the days of Radio Dublin. Valerie, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Eddie. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. How did you get involved in pirate radio? Especially for a woman.
Well, at those times, like the 80s, it wasn't really, women weren't really encouraged to participate in radio. But I always wanted to do radio, and my parents, like, we didn't have money. I came from the Liberties. And,
great place.
You know, born and reared in the Liberties, and my dad said, no, she can forget about that stupid idea, this is not happening. She's going to work. So I thought, I'm going to do this anyway. So one evening I got up and I made my way up to Radio Dublin in Sarsfield, knocked at the door and said, hiya, you know, and Eamon Cook was, yeah. And I said, well, I'd like to be on radio. So I brought in and I was told, well, you'll have to do the phones. We need a telephonist and after maybe about a week or two then, I was put on 4 to 6 in the morning where nobody would hear me.
The graveyard shift?
Yeah, so I was absolutely delighted with that one. Got the sleeping bag, got the bus down, you know, slept until
The show starts.
the show started, and then got the bus after 6 o'clock.
And done your show.
So done my show, and then I suppose really unaware to myself, I progressed maybe broadcasting within that hour.
You're probably learning as you were going along.
Well, obviously that's what he meant, only I thought, no, I can do this, I don't need to do this. I have 3 listeners, you know what I mean? I'm brilliant, you know, as you think it. Like.
Nah, well, that's
So,
especially on the graveyard shift.
then I was put on night time, Monday nights. I remember Radio City had opened,
That's right.
and
Bit
they
of
had,
competition.
and I was told, you're going on a Monday night, and you have to
Boost the listeners.
boost the listeners on a Monday night. So I thought, what am I going to do? So drugs was very big at that time in Dublin. So I linked in with Jervis Street Hospital at that time into casualty, and
Which was very innovative for the time.
no, it was
and-
brilliant because
and still, like, as a pirate radio station, illegal trying to do this was
Yeah.
it was a great achievement
and they
for a
accepted
small
it.
station.
Like, do you know what I mean? It was very acceptable. And then, as I said to you earlier on, we were talking. Like then, I kind of branched out, doing like stuff for prisoners in Mountjoy, lads as I called them in Mountjoy, and they used to write in requests.
And
You know, and I would give it out on a Monday night. I rather liked late night radio. I like the daytime was fine, but I did rather like the nighttime because I always thought the nighttime had the listenership that I liked.
Yeah, the type of listeners you were looking at.
You know, I would get people ringing and saying, I'm doing my ironing. Would you have Christopher Cross?
There used to be a woman always around, Patricia Murphy. She was ringing.
Yeah, Patricia Murphy was always around, yeah. And I felt that people late at night, always the time to talk to you, and you could talk to them. You weren't under as much pressure. So I did really prefer late night radio.
And what would have been your highlight at Radio Dublin?
Well, the highlight was without the Jag having to be pushed everywhere we went. You know,
Famous Jag.
like Eamon would, he would say, we're in Fairview today, there's a family day. We'd all go out in the white Jag, and we'd all push it when it was over. And he'd be there mortified. Remember Shay West and everybody pushing the Jag.
Big
and we'd be going,
Radio Dublin blazing across the side of it.
to do this. But we did it. We went back to the station, we got a bag of chips, and everybody was happy. But the highlight, I think, was really the Lebanon trip.
Yeah, this is where Radio Dublin had a Lebanon request show
There was
for
a-
the
yeah,
troops to send in requests
Yeah, and they used to send tapes every week, like
out to the Lebanon.
from the Lebanon into Radio Dublin. And on a Sunday morning, then the request show would go on.
Which
You know what I
was
mean?
like at the time, the Irish were serving the United Nations out
Yeah.
in South Lebanon.
Yeah, and Angie would have presented that programme.
Yeah,
And I would be just a sidekick in the programme as well. So then Eamon came along and said he would like us to go to the Lebanon. RT was going
Just
at
like
the
that?
time. Yeah, Geraldine Brannigan. And we thought it's probably like O'Connell Street or Bray or...
yes. Not quite aware of the facts of what
The
was going on.
government didn't want us to go at the time. They there was
It was.
a lot of phone calls back and forward. They didn't want us to go. So we went.
This was directly to Radio Dublin to try and stop them to
Yeah.
go.
But we went, and we got off the plane, and I remember so distinctly seeing Yara Asafa. He was only young and he was gorgeous. And I was saying to Angie, oh, he's gorgeous. Oh, that's your man from the television. Angie, how come he's here? He got a big, gun
Yeah,
on
yeah.
his shoulder, big turban. And then this Kampala drove up with an Irish flag, and it was the Irish ambassador, Sean Whelan, and Declan Holmes. I think he was visiting Lebanon at that time because they were setting up the European Union then.
All right.
That was the beginning of Europe.
Yes.
So we were taken to the town in Lebanon, in Beirut, and we were under armed guards like all the time.
Some experience
We
for a
were-
young girl.
We were introduced to our bodyguards, and I was saying to Angie, why do we need them? And then it was kind of sinking in.
This is not Bray.
These women are all in black.
Yeah.
What's wrong with them?
Yeah.
But everywhere we went, this Kampala drove was everywhere, and they stayed outside at night time.
How long did you spend out there in the Lebanon?
Well, you know, if my memory serves me correct, which is not saying it's accurate, right?
No worry.
It was longer, like, than we anticipated. I think it was for a week, and we stayed extra days because
Trying to get back.
trying to get back. As I explained to you, I really wanted to go up to the Tiverton because that's where all the soldiers were.
in Camshaman, yeah.
Paddy's Bar, like, was very famous up there for the Irish soldiers, and Geraldine Brannigan had gone ahead with RTE to the concert for Paddy's Day, like, you know,
And
up there.
Radio Dublin were the illegal
So,
entrance into this and probably weren't treated with the same.
being so nice
generosity?
as I was, I had made friends with some Americans there, and one of them was the American ambassador at the time. So he invited me to the American Embassy for Paddy's Day.
Oh, lovely.
So I said to Angie, we'll have to do this. So we went, and the floor was green, the chairs were green, the drink was green, the sausages was green. I never saw so much green in all my life. And there was a colonel there. I'd rather not mention his name.
That's
if that's
fine,
all
yeah,
right.
that's grand.
He was in charge of the Irish contingent out there. So had a few drinks, and I said, come here, can I go in the morning on the truck? Yeah, no problem, Val, off you go. So I went, said to Angie, we're going on this. So we went, and when we were up there, then we couldn't get back down because Sadat had bombed the road. He knew Paddy's Day, they'd be off guard. So we had to stay, like, in the hospital up there. That's the only place, safe place they could leave us.
Jeez,
the
it
hospital.
wasn't really brave, was it?
No, it was a horrible experience. The hospital was a horrible
Was it,
experience. Yeah, horrible.
And when you came back, like, I'm sure the troops were delighted to see you out there.
Ah, the guys.
They were sure
were
well used to hearing your voices.
We met, like, soldiers that already had sent us tapes and everything. You know, like one or two of them had died, like, in the Lebanon when we came back.
Yeah.
Things had happened. James Foran, James drove the truck, drove us up to Tiverton. He was shot.
Jeez.
Like, when we come back, he was all over the papers, and, you know, because it was really...
It shows you how dangerous it was when you went out there.
Yeah, we went to have a look at the prison. Like, I want to see, you know, where do you put the guards if they break the law, and, you know,
The military prison.
went up and had a look at it, and the soldier there, like, was explaining what happens and what most of the offences could be classed. He was explaining the different things in different countries, you know, that...
And did you stay then with Radio Dublin?
I did. When we came back then, like, there was a lot of trouble with the government as well, you know, and we didn't kind of do interviews because there was a lot that we did say.
Yeah, you were told not to.
That
And did you stay with Radio Dublin right up to 1988?
Yeah, I stayed until the very end, yeah. And then I was involved in it when Eamon opened up. I didn't go to Vincent Street, but then I went back again then when he had it in Wheatfield.
Yeah. I mean, were you in the studio in 1988 when the station closed?
Mm.
And what was that night like?
It was like a cloud hanging down.
Was it? Yeah.
You couldn't describe it. Like, there's no words.
It was a full studio.
I could tell you, Eddie, we were sad, but we weren't. We were nothing.
It was a full studio.
It was numb.
Because
everybody was there.
Every name and
everybody was there, but like the feeling was numb. It wasn't. It wasn't sad. It was just like everybody was numb. This is actually happening.
Well, Eamon had decided to stay on the air and defy the law anyway, so he was going to carry on.
Yeah.
But I know most of the DJs from around town who may have closed on the 30th all went up to Radio Dublin for the last hour.
Yeah, they made their way up.
And after Radio Dublin, did you stay on in radio?
What actually happened was I was offered to do work in West Dublin Access. No, it was West Dublin Radio then in the college in Ballyfermot, and I did an awful lot of broadcasting there, quite a lot. I went more into at that time I experimented. I like to experiment in radio.
Very good. Best place to do it.
And if I get an idea, I like to just pop off and say,
see if I can do it.
Go with this.
Exactly. Best radio is always the best.
So I decided then to go into kind of do music programs in the radio station in the college, and I thought, I think I'll have a buzz with this now, you know. And I thought of the name in 2 minutes, Celtic Sounds.
Very good.
I just thought of it like.
Excellent.
And then what happened was the blooming thing just turned out so much of a success, which wasn't intended.
But that's the best.
It was
best
for,
successes always are
it was for
unexpected.
Irish bands that weren't known, but I ended up like with Irish bands that were known.
Yeah.
You know, coming
to the show. Yeah.
Sometimes I had two bands coming in, like, and I was saying, I'm going to do this in an hour. It just became totally popular, and I remember Damien Rice had left Juniper at that time. And Damien would have been one of my main guests at the time on Celtic Sounds.
Very good.
And he'd come in with the guitar. And my favourite song of him was The Professor. And
well.
I heard the real version. And I know what the song is all about. Because he told me. And I'd make great friends with Damien like at that time. And
it really is now. It's brilliant for me to be able to talk to someone like it. I remember December 31st, 88 well. It's like embedded in my memory. And I'm delighted to have someone to talk to who was there that day. Valerie Coffey, thank you very much. My guest is Garvin Rigby. And Garvin is another one of those pirate era DJs who oversaw that period between 1986 and 1992. Garvin, welcome.
Hi, Eddie.
First question, like I ask everybody, why did you get involved in pirate radio? How did you get involved in pirate radio?
I suppose
That's a multifaceted question.
Exactly, yeah. I was trying to think back of how or why or when. I suppose growing up, I was fascinated with football. It was Man United everything. Man United this, Man United that, organising Saputo tournaments and organising football games against a local team in the next state.
Okay.
And I was just football mad. No interest in radio. And suddenly about, I suppose, it was about, say, 13 or 14, mid-80s, I heard a station called Nova and I heard a station called Sunshine and it kind of caught my imagination. And suddenly the radio drug, as everyone says, that radio drug that gets into you was born. And suddenly Man United this and the Man United that went out the window, no interest anymore in the Premier League or the First Division as it was back then. And suddenly it was all about radio. It's about Nova, it's about Sunshine, it's about all American radio and the fascination with everything about radio. And the music and the DJ voice and how he's playing the songs and all that captured my imagination. Radio Luxembourg as well was big at the time. So I remember hearing that on BBC Radio 1. Everything to do with radio, pirate and legal at the time. It just caught the bug. And a friend of mine, so a guy in school at the time, was a year ahead of me in school, a guy called Kevin Brannigan. And I gave him a demo and said, look, here's a demo of me. Now, obviously, it was awful. Your first demo, no idea. To press record, music up top of the pops, and you're doing a link of some sort of radio show. And I gave him the demo, and he said, that's great, but we'd love to maybe get you involved. And there was a couple of teenagers running a radio station back in '88. And he said, it'd be great to get you involved, but you can't talk. So fair enough, I didn't mind that. Fine. First opportunity in, obviously it wasn't very good at my first links and my first attempt of DJ speak or as a presenter, so I was a spinner, like a lot of people starting off in radio.
The ultimate clutter-free.
Ultimate clutter-free. The days before it was a computer, a long play tape deck, whatever it is, so you went in, you played a song, you flipped over the next song, you played back-to-back, played a few liners in between. Garden shed radio, a couple of teenagers running it, a couple of teenagers listening to it, literally a couple of teenagers listening to it. Maybe 3 or 4 listeners, and that was the first break into radio. And that would have been about 87, I think it was, 87. So towards the end of the first phase of the
broadcasting
pirate,
revolution.
The revolution of the pirate radio of the 80s, yeah.
So were you on air in December 88?
I was actually on air doing 3 shows on 3 different stations.
Very good.
On that day. I was on a station called Signal, which was that first station. I was on a station called Kiss 106. Which is also was involved with Kevin and Mike, the 2 guys involved on the other station. They had a bit of a split, and the Signal went there and Kiss went there. So I ended up doing both shows, a bit of loyalty to both stations. And also another friend of mine was running a station called Zyke FM in '88, and actually we made the front page of the Herald that day, which is interesting enough because Nova, Sunshine, Q, Nova closed down that station, Q, Sunshine, and Zyke closed down. Everyone. Who's like? So I was on air in Zyke FM as well, doing the show on the 30th, because I remember a lot of stations closed down on the 30th and other stations closed down on the 31st. So there was a bit of an overlap. So they ended up doing, between those 2 days, they ended up doing 3 shows on 3 different stations.
And what was the feeling? Was it elation? Was it the end of the beginning of the end? Was it sadness? What was the feeling, the overriding feeling in those stations?
Well, see, I suppose for me it was a little bit of starting off, because again, bear in mind, I suppose 88, I was 15, just gone 16 kind of age. Sorry, just 15 going into 16. So I was still young, it's kind of fresh rookie into radio, but all this great taste of having radio was suddenly coming to an end. I was going, what? It's coming to an end? Everyone was going. And the fantastic, the hot hits of Sunshine, or the smooth grooves of Class, or Capital Nice Guy with alternative rock. It was a great era to have such a choice. And back then, as you know, it was choice. The alternative station literally sounded like an alternative station. and the love song station sounded like a love song station, as opposed to them both sound the same and a little bit of a crossover alternative love songs you just find today on the one station, you know. So it was a little bit of a different era. But for me, the silence hit me, and actually was fairly upset and emotional, especially at the close down of Robbie Robinson's speech and that kind of thing on Sunshine.
6 o'clock, yeah.
Yeah, 6 o'clock on Sunshine in 1988. And there was eerie feeling of silence suddenly hit home. And there's nothing on. I think there was RT on, and Millennium 88 was still going. I think they extended for an extra 6 months at a time. So it was kind of, for me, it was an introduction to radio. It was great to have actually been able to be involved in that side of the cut-off.
Yeah, before and
after into the next phase of pirate radio and legal radio into the 90s, you know. But I found it was fairly exciting around that time as well, because everyone was afraid to turn on a transmitter suddenly in January 1989. And suddenly
penalties had increased.
The penalties had increased. There was a chance now really of going to jail, of 2 years in jail. Now I know 1 or 2 stations stayed on in Monaghan and Dublin, but a few little stations started to jump up, and it was an interesting time for those six months of 1989, because a lot of stations suddenly started appearing for a couple of hours here, a couple of there, you know. A couple of hours, like I remember saying called K104, I think it was a guy called Paul Ring at the time, and he used to come on and do these kind of dance mixes for maybe 3 or 4 hours in the evening, suddenly go off again.
In, gone, yeah.
In, gone, before there was enough time.
As it was back in the 70s when Pirates started first, it was the hobby, and, you know.
Yeah, you go on for a few hours, you go off again, because that, you know, you didn't want to be caught, should we say, you know. I remember being involved in a station in '89, and Lizzie, that was like that, and we went on air for 3 or 4 hours. And again, I was in school at the time, and a few of the other guys involved were in school as well. And we'll go on at the weekend maybe for 3 or 4 hours. Would announce a phone number, and the phones would hop off the hook. And just thinking it, people must have been scanning the dial,
looking for something.
In 1989, scanning the dial, looking for anything, and suddenly, bang, a station playing music. There's not silence for 3 or 4 hours, playing songs you can request, and the phone would hop. You know, you use a pay phone so you wouldn't get caught, that kind of thing. You know, I remember using my parents' phone at one stage, and the phone just went off the hook for 3 or 4 days later. You were still ringing.
I'm sure parents weren't overly impressed.
They weren't very overly impressed. No, absolutely not. But the thing about it is that the fascination was at the time was that for hours and hours and hours there'd be silence on the radio. And people, anyone who's kind of post 88 or anyone now who's 16 years of age with 200 TV channels and 20 radio channels wouldn't understand that. There was literally silence. Apart from RT Radio 1, at the time, don't forget RT Radio 2 was Jerry Ryan.
We had gone from a full band, almost full, on
to virtually nothing. And Jerry Ryan was on the time, which meant that on RT, all you had was talk. There was no music in Ireland in 88. And literally, remember the headline in 88 from, I think it was the Herald, or it was, I'm not sure if the Irish Press was even running in 88, but anyway, one of those evening papers was the day the music died.
Yeah.
Because literally, the music had died that day, and that was it. So it was kind of like a cut-off point into the next era. And then from there, as we know, we had obviously the era of, you know.
You still, though, you defied the law still, you carried on in pirate radio.
I continued on pirate radio for a long time. In fact, I was one of the few people who went from legal radio back into pirate radio. I know you had a guest there on some stage on another show who went from a legal station to pirate, but I was one of those people as well. What happened, I remember being, again from around, I remember doing the 89, a few shows in Radio Dublin at the time where it was a bit kind of, you know, you're going to get in real trouble here, dodgy here, get arrested here or not. But then the stations started to come back. Stations like Sunset and DLR started to come back in the mid-90s, and it went into like the big station of 1993 after Sunset Radio was Kiss FM. At the time, I remember there was jamming going on with some of the stations, and I'm not going to name names, but there were certain stations being jammed, certain people being jammed, and people running up and down mountainsides, avoiding the station being closed down. And I remember at one stage, a survey came out that something like 50% of teenagers between 15 and 19 were listening in Dublin to this particular station, Kiss FM, you know. So it certainly hit home with a large audience. And then obviously Pulse FM as well. But I went from Kiss at the time into legal radio, went into 90 FM, went to advertising and sales there at the time. And then I remember doing sales and advertising. It was great, it was bringing in income and all that. But I remember, you know,
the Graw was still there.
The Graw was still there, the pub was still there. And I remember going to Portmarnock Beach one sunny afternoon. And a couple of guys were running a station called Hot 107. Most of the guys involved with that now are in legal radio 98 and 104. And they had this big outside broadcast on the beach. It was sunny, it was sunshine, it was thousands of people around. They were doing outside broadcast, they had the jeeps on, they were in shorts and shades. It was radio, it was beach radio, it was great. I went, you know what? I'm going back into radio. I'm going back in behind the mic. At the time, I suppose in the mid-90s, there was only 2 stations on air in Dublin, 104 and 98. And those same presenters were there all the way through for 5-10 years. So there was no real break to get in.
Monotony had already set in.
Exactly, yeah. So there was no real break to get in. So the way to get in really was to go back on air and try and break our way back through. But again, the station was starting to become superpowers almost again, because there's a station like Pulse FM, Magic and Energy up north, ABC in Waterford, the big stations.
The regular schedules always came back in.
Exactly, the Pirates are coming back up again. We almost had a full band. We had Fanta, we had Nova 94 playing dance. You had dance music, you had Jazz FM. So you had so many stations. Again, between the legal stations and the pirate stations, you almost had a full band again by the mid-90s. It was great. Up until I think 2000, was around 2001, Black Tuesday. It was 2001, I think it was around 2001. So up to that point, I had a great selection of stations. So I actually went back into pirate radio, back into radio. Went on to do some of the evening shows again on Pulse and some of the big stations in the late 90s. And got involved in an 80s station, Sun FM, which was a continuous 80s station. Outside of America, one of the only cities in the world which had a dedicated 80s station. And that became huge as well. We got a lot of people in that. And that was one of the first stations to actually introduce voice tracking. Because the station was almost effectively all voice tracked. Sorry, just to ruin any illusions that people think at the time. But it was actually voice at the time. It was literally, I remember, the whole radio station was literally in a box.
And automated.
It was an automated station,
But successful.
But successful.
And highly.
Yeah. And again, it was the music, it was the vibe of the station. The thing, I suppose.
It was that claim out for nostalgia, and it was a perfect niche.
Of the nostalgia, and played TV theme songs or clips from movies and things like that, just to kind of, give that kind of nostalgia feel to it, But I suppose around that era, the pirate radio, I suppose, had come to its second phase, I suppose, And again, started to come to a halt after Black Tuesday. Yeah. More stations got licensed, and as we know today, there's a much better spread of stations of the band. However, I suppose from a lot of people's point of view, it's very, it's all the same.
Yeah, it's
even the niche stations still sound like the main stations, because a lot of regulation means that the stations all have to have a certain percent current affairs, a certain percent of Irish music, blah blah blah. So they have to have the same format. So the regulations almost made the stations the same.
Yeah. And today you are involved in Spirit.
Yeah, I suppose two stations. One, I suppose, part-time with Christmas FM every year. And then my full-time-ish gig, when I'm not running my own business as well, I run Spirit Radio, program director of Spirit Radio. So I do that kind of on a part-time basis, Again, it's this niche station, a lot of volunteers. In fact, most of the presenters on air are volunteers. Who are actually working in other commercial stations or else have been working in other stations in the past, So that's my full-time gig, and like I say, Christmas FM is, although it's only Christmas, the planning goes all year round.
Well, Garvin, it's been an absolute pleasure. I thank you very much.
Thanks, Eddie.
Ladies and gentlemen, Garvin Rigby.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Aidan Leonard.
Q102.
Non-stop music on Solid Gold Saturday.
Q102. Your music. Q1. Our song is your song.
Your friends on 539.
We care about you.
On Sunshine Radio. Sunshine Radio.
My guest is Paul Shepherd. Paul, welcome.
Thank you, Eddie. Nice to be here.
Like I've asked most of my guests, the easiest question in the world: how did you get involved in pirate radio?
How and why is probably the quick and simple answer. Why? I enjoyed music when I grew up in Ireland in the 60s. There was very little music. Even in the 70s, you listened to probably Radio Luxembourg at night time. It was your only real option. I was in bed with measles as a young fella, and an old maiden aunt bought me a little transistor radio, and that's what got me hooked on radio.
On radio, yeah.
Strangely enough, and she's still alive today. She's 94.
God bless her. And how did she manage to inveigle you then? Would she have inveigled you to get into pirate radio?
No. I mean, obviously being interested in listening to radio and listening to music, there was no real opportunity during the day because Luxembourg didn't come on until 7 in the evening. And I happened round about 1974-75 Sunday afternoon listening to BBC Radio 1 and heard Radio Dublin. And
253, which would have been not too far away from it.
Which actually, in those days, they used to come on 15 minutes before they went on air. They used to go on to Radio 1's frequency and jam them, basically say, Radio Dublin's coming on the air, tune up to 253, and within about 5 or 10 minutes you tune up there, and there they'd be. So that's how it came across.
So that's...
Yeah.
And what was the first station you worked on?
Capital Radio in 1978, Bachelor's Walk. So that was my first venture into it.
And was it always an ambition, or was it just something you fell into?
Probably something I fell into. Because I enjoyed Radio Luxembourg and I enjoyed the style of the DJs. It made it more interesting than just listening to music without, anything in between it. And I kind of felt, it sounds good. I'd like to give that a go. I didn't know what I'd be like, mind you, and I'd no kind of illusions about myself because there was no schooling in it. Basically, you went in and it was a learning curve on the air, very much so. Yeah.
And of the few stations, not all the stations, what would you say the highlights of your pirate career, we'll say, call it? A career, if that's the one of a better word.
I suppose you could probably call them more low lights, but the low lights tend to be the highlights. They're the things you remember.
Especially in the look backs.
Well, absolutely. My very first programme on Capital Radio, the first record I ever played was Frankie Valli, The Night. 10 seconds into the song, the arm fell off the record deck, skidded across the record onto the floor. I absolutely froze and fell
into the world of DJing.
Well, this was my baptism of fire, quite literally. And God bless him, Chris Barry, who was my producer at the time, managed to salvage the situation, but I don't think I recovered throughout the programme up to the end. I was just a bag of nerves after that. That's probably the one I look back on most of all. I had other interesting things on the various stations I worked at. So there would be a lot of things over the years, and then obviously in more recent times, or within the last kind of post 1988, but certainly the pre 1988 years were the more interesting and exciting.
And where were the stations that you worked for? ABC, and you worked for?
Yeah, after Capital, I worked briefly for East Coast Radio, which I think you probably know yourself. Yes. Very briefly there. Then I worked as a producer on Southside Radio, which in those days we were in the caravan up behind the Silver Tassie, so I produced the rock show there.
Paul Vincent's?
No, it was Andy Ruan was running it, and it was a guy called Brian Holland, who worked for Radio Hauraki in New Zealand, was living in Ireland at the time, did the rock show, hadn't got any music with him here. I did it all for him, and that was the first time I'd ever produced. I enjoyed doing that, and actually came across Brian Holland only last year. First time I spoke to him in 30 years. He's still alive and kicking and back in New Zealand, so I was delighted to meet him. After that, I inevitably, as everybody in the radio business did, fell into Radio Dublin. Probably fell out of it more or less just as quickly. Set up ABC with a couple of friends, ran that for 3 years, and basically when that closed down, 1984, did a few bits and bobs up to 1988, and that was really it.
And in 1988, another one of my guests was Walter Hegarty, and you started Premier.
Yeah, Premier had started around about 1981 on AM. I got involved. Actually, I can't even remember how I became involved in it. Actually, I do. I tell a lie. The guy who owned Premier, who started, actually DJ'd for us on ABC. Interesting in that he had no records. All his music was on cassette, so we had to have cassette decks in the studio for him to play. And I think a lot of them were recorded off other radio stations, so we had to cut them off.
Bigger radio stations.
Yeah, well, they had to be cut off before Jimmy Savile or whoever, Tony Blackburn, suddenly cut in, but let's not go there. So he came across me somewhere along the way, said, would you be interested in working for this station? And it was in a location that was very close to Walter. I'd never met Walter before, so we actually literally started the station just as the legislation was coming in, and we kind of did it for a while thereafter.
Yeah, but Premier was one of those few stations that kind of came on after the legislation. Was there any fear in you that the station would be raided, you know, was the fear of the new penalties? Like there were severe penalties at the being imposed.
Yeah.
No, they weren't the £2 fine anymore. It was €10,000 or £10,000 at a time.
Not to that extent, because I think the problem was in the 70s, certainly people weren't aware of their rights, and even though you were breaking the law, and you would be foolish not to accept it or realise it, you're still entitled to certain rights under the law, even if you're breaking it. Commonly in the 70s, if your station was raided, basically, you know, a hole was knocked in the wall with a sledgehammer, a search warrant was flung in, and they'd all pile in behind it. Whereas we were a little bit more aware of our rights then, and there was probably a suspicion that they weren't really going to make an example out of a small station that came on for a few hours on a Saturday or Sunday. If they were going to make an example of anyone, it would have been one of the bigger stations who challenged them by being on 24/7. So it probably wasn't really there in the back of our minds. I don't think. It was there, but I didn't really give it any thought.
And in all the years that were on air, were you ever subject to a raid, or?
I personally no, but I had not so much a station. I was running a station at the time, but I was testing a transmitter from the house where I lived, which was my parents' house at the time. And during the course of the day, there was a knock on the door.
Dreaded knock.
The dreaded knock. My mother opened the door, and my mother was quite a petite woman, and she was asked, "What is that aerial on the roof?" To which she replied, "What aerial?" And it was, "Well, that kind of 80-foot mast on your roof." And she said, "Oh, that's my son's CB radio. I know nothing about that." So there was a bit of backwards and forwards, and she was told, "Well, we think that you're running an illegal radio station here. We wish to come in and inspect the installation." To which my mother then replied, "Have you got a search warrant?"
Well on the ball.
And the guy, "No." I said, "Good luck, so." And she slammed the door on their faces. At which stage my father then rang me at work and ate me and told me to get home and to get it out of his house before they came back. So that was my one rush.
And what are you doing today, Paul?
What am I doing today? In radio terms,
Exactly.
My only involvement at the moment is with Christmas FM.
With Walter again.
With Walter again. So yeah, our paths have kept on crossing.
And this year, Christmas FM, and is it the same as last year? You're doing it for charity?
Yeah, we'll be doing it for charity. We're kind of just in the process of wrapping all that up at the moment.
And you've done it last year for?
We did for the ISPCC last year, so.
And raised a large sum of money?
Yeah, we raised just over 116,000, so.
For a temporary radio licence is a magnificent achievement.
Well, particularly in the current economic climate. I mean, people don't have the money, but I think it's indicative. It's a good time of the year, I suppose, if you're trying to raise money, because people, although they're spending a lot of money on themselves to make themselves feel good in harsh times, there's a realisation out there, and I think people are quite generous.
And a question I've more or less asked all the guests I've had is, what would you say is pirate radio, we'll say of the 80s, what is their legacy for today's broadcasters?
I suppose it paved the way for them. I think inevitably commercial radio was going to come no matter what. It might have accelerated the process, but when we bear in mind that 2FM started in, when was it, 1978, it took 10 years after that, and of course they fought tooth and nail to try and make sure that there would be no competition to them. I think one of the downsides, an irritant to me, is that there would have been a lot of people who railed against that position, quite rightly, up to 1988, and there are now people who railed against that position who are using the same argument to try and stop competition now. So they've very much turned from poacher to gamekeeper, and I find that irritating. I'm more in favour of deregulation, while accepting you can't just let anyone on willy-nilly, and the spectrum is not an infinite resource.
And as a pirate, there were buccaneering days as such.
They were, and they were...
living on the seat of pants.
Absolutely, yeah. But I think there was more soul to radio then. Radio now has become very much networked big business, and it's driven by the advertising agencies. It's largely, I think, driven by the impetus to make money. And I suppose, like most businesses now, businesses are run by accountants or by the money men. They're not necessarily run by the people who have the love of it. I think that's the big difference. I mean, there's certainly passionate people out there, but I think they can only work within certain limitations, and I'm sure it must be quite frustrating for them.
Yes. Paul, thank you very much.
Not
Speaking
at all.
of money, I hope Christmas FM make thousands this year. Paul Shepherd, thank you very much.
Thank you, Eddie. Cheers.
Within each decade, a pirate radio station has made a name for itself. In the 1930s, Michael Madden became the first person to be convicted under the 1926 Wireless Telegraphy Act for illegal broadcasting in Limerick. In the 1940s, Sean McNeil became the only person in the world, having been convicted of pirate broadcasting, died while on hunger strike in jail. In the 1950s, Tony Boylan experimented with a number of radio stations across Dublin. And in the late 1960s, the success of Radio Caroline in the North Sea led to Radio Dublin and Radio Jackie in Cork. In the 1970s, pirate radio became more bold, broadcasting for longer hours and employing schedules. In 1972, Radio Melinda provided the authorities with a unique challenge. When the national broadcaster went on strike, Radio Melinda was the only station broadcasting on air in Dublin, leading immediately to a raid by the authorities. Alternative Radio Dublin exposed the need for an alternative to RTE in the late 1970s and early 1980s. While in the late 1980s, super pirates arrived, with the likes of Radio Nova, Sunshine Radio and ERI in Cork. The financial success of these stations, coupled with the lack of tax regulation and rights payments, created a sense of urgency for the government to legislate against the pirate radio stations, leading to the arrival of the 1988 Wireless Telegraphy Act. I'm in the Plush studios of FM 104 today, and it's a long way from Plush studios that my next guest has come from. Andy Preston, more of a garden shed pirate radio start.
Absolutely, and what fun we had back then as well.
And where did you start?
I started in a radio station called Radio Diamond. It was up above the Star Snooker Hall in Crumlin, which used to be the roller rink. Before that it was a cinema, I think. But that's where I started. I'd been interested in radio for a few years, and it was only really when I was put on the spot by my career guidance teacher when I went into secondary school. What do you want to be? Oh God, what do I want to be? I'd like to be a DJ on the radio.
On the radio?
On the radio. Not just in a club, no, I just really wanted to be on the radio because, I mean, I'd grown up listening to Nova, Sunshine. Radio Dublin was just down the road, and I was always kind of fascinated by the big mast on the Inchicore Road. And I remember going down visiting with two cousins of mine one summer, and we decided that we wanted to start our own radio station. When we thought that was impossible, we said, oh, maybe we'd just like to be DJs. My other cousin soon forgot about the idea, but I pursued it then, and that's how I ended up starting it. Diamond in August the 4th, 1987. I still remember the date. I do, and I mark it every year because it really was a day when my life changed.
And you were there like in 88. Well, you were on the air in 88 when the new law came in.
Mm-hmm.
But you stayed in pirate radio, whereas a lot of other people went off the air looking for the license. You decided there was a career in pirate radio?
Yeah, I mean, I was only 14 when all the stations went off air, and to go and work on, what this was at the beginning, Capital Radio or any of those stations, was just a dream at that stage. So I thought the best way of getting some experience with myself was just to stay in the business. So I was one of the first on Radio Dublin in 1989, along with Bernard Delaney, Gary Hayes, Mark Grace, Mike Wilson.
Flying the buccaneering flag.
Right, yes, and I mean, that was scary, that was.
Waiting for the raid.
Exactly, but I mean, it was a completely different atmosphere to what had gone before in 1988. I mean, as you know, stations were fully fledged businesses employing lots of people.
Paying VAT, whatever.
Paying VAT, paying tax,
Ever fear with the new laws, ever fear about having to pay out 10,000 in a fine?
Do you know something? I'll tell you something, Eddie. The excitement of actually just sitting there doing it just put all of that to the back of everybody's mind. I mean, we were terrified. I have to say we were really, really terrified because, we almost felt like murderers on the run sitting in that little studio in Inchicore Road because I remember the console would have been here and we had a little kind of hole cut in the window just so we could see out into the driveway of 58 Inchicore Road. And I remember being there one afternoon with Bernard Delaney, I think he was on air, and all of a sudden a car tore up the driveway. Tore up the driveway at breakneck speed. Bernard just took the record off the deck that he had on and was about to run out the door, and it was only the guy knocked on the door and said, "Oh yeah, here's your Bob Gass tapes." You remember Bob Gass, the American evangelist that used to have a regular slot on Radio Dublin? I remember just Bernard just getting another record out and saying, "Sorry about that, false alarm, we're back on air now."
It's almost bunker mentality up there.
Yeah, and that's Adrian St. James was the man who came up with the phrase "the bunker," live from the bunker, because of course the station was raided then in February, and really kind of went deep underground at that stage. Now it was just all tape programs, and
but ticked away.
It ticked away and stayed there for many years after that. I moved on. The 90s, of course, then brought the Dance Pirates, because I mean, obviously, there was a big gap there. When the new legitimate stations came on air, they just weren't to everybody's taste. I mean, for a long time, between 91, 92, this station and 98 were competing with each other for the over 25 audience. There was nothing there if you were aged between 15 and 24, and that was where the resurgence of the Pirates came from in the 90s. Then, when Sunset, NSR, Power FM, Kiss FM, Club FM, they all came back and had huge audiences simply because they were filling a gap that was left there by the legitimate stations who decided to ignore that audience. There still is a gap. It's still not perfect. It never will be perfect. But I mean, I think it's certainly better now than it was, say, 10 years ago. There's more stations there now.
More choice.
Exactly. But I mean, if you were young in the 90s and you wanted to listen to radio, there wasn't much choice, and that's where Sunset
and how was the leap from unlicensed illegal broadcasting to legal broadcasting when you came to FM 104?
Completely different.
Mentally.
I have to say, completely different. I was probably arrogant enough to think that I'd come in here and teach them how to do it. But when you come in here and see people like Colm Hayes, Greg Cochran, Dave Kelly, who'd been in the business for years and who were all heroes of mine, anybody that worked on the big stations in the 80s were all heroes of mine. And to come in here and, you know, work alongside people like that, you realise very, very quickly that, gosh, I really don't know anything about this business. I'm starting from scratch here.
And what would, in your honest opinion, looking back now, even from into the 90s with pirate radio, what's the legacy of pirate radio? What has it left? It was a revolution in the 80s. So what kind of legacy has it left?
Well, I mean, the legacy it's immeasurable, really, when you think about it, because what we have now started in the 80s, and particularly with the super pirate era, when the likes of Robbie Robinson and Chris Carey came in and started Nova and Sunshine. It really set the precedent for what we have today. And I mean, I'm sure there would have been independent commercial radio eventually, but it wouldn't have come as soon as it did. And when I say it came as soon as it did, I mean, people like Robbie Robinson were there campaigning for years for a license, you know. Unfortunately, eventually he didn't get it, which I think, I mean, is a crime to this day that he didn't.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I mean, if anybody was campaigning for, you know, the legislation to be brought through and for
the
independent
type of station that Dublin was crying out for,
yes, exactly,
Sunshine was the ground plan that should have been on air.
Yeah, definitely.
And FM 104 going from strength to strength, and you were probably one of the most popular DJs on the station. Where's FM 104 going for in the next 10 years?
Hard to know. I mean, I think it's more about survival for anybody these days. I mean, even at the position that we're in, it's hard to generate business and hard to make money as it is. So I suppose it's just onwards and upwards and try to make the best of what we have, try to hang on to what we have and just keep it as it is. I think the key thing about FM 104 is just there's a level of consistency there. People know what they're going to hear when they switch on every day, whether it's going to be the Strawberry Alarm Clock, me, Ben in the Afternoons, the phone show or whatever. Jesus. And I think that's something that's stood to us in the last few years. I mean, I've been on the 10 to 3 show 12 years now. That sort of thing is unheard of. Yes, I shouldn't be saying that now in case the boss is watching. Time to get rid of him. But, you know, 12 years on the same show. I mean, I signed up to do it like for a year. I signed a contract for a year thinking, if I get a year out of this, I'll be grand. But they kept coming back and offering another contract and offering another contract. And I'm still here.
Continue.
I hope so.
Andy Preston, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eddie.
Our song is your song.
Your friends on 539.
We care Radio Nova, the music's just begun. Radio Nova, Europe's #1. Radio Nova, the music's just begun. Radio Nova, Europe's #1.
My guest is Walter Hegarty, and I'd like to welcome Walter to the show.
Hi.
Walter, how did you get involved in pirate radio?
Well, I suppose, like many a young lad in Dublin, I started off in a garden shed with a friend and a valve and, 10 or 15 watts on medium wave. And that was back in the late 70s.
What did they call the station?
Back then it was Radio Seagull on medium wave. Jeez. Which is going back.
The name was just plucked out of the sky, or was it referred to the one in the North Sea?
It was from a song Sister Seagull by Bebop Deluxe. So there you go.
And moved on to?
Well, after that, we went on to shortwave as Radio Deluxe and managed to get all around the world on, 100 watts on shortwave, which was great fun. And then was part of the team on Premier, and we operated on medium wave through the kind of tail end of the 70s and 80s.
And through the 80s then?
Through the 80s, worked away with that kind of on and off. Hobby, yes, very much so, for the love of it, as you do as a young lad. And then as the 80s moved on, acquired an FM transmitter, and
progress was made?
Progress was made, because so we had FM and medium wave, albeit on relatively low powers. And then from the studio that was in my place in Sandymount in the second half of the 80s, we started doing live programs on FM on Sundays, and that was great fun because we had somebody go down to the phone box down the road and take the requests. So all the stuff that the legends are made
well,
of.
that's exactly what pirate radio was about. It was on the fly. It was, not exactly cutting edge technology, but it worked. And you had, I'd say, you had a fair good listenership.
Well, after the major unlicensed stations went off, once the Novas and the Sunshines went off during that end of the year,
yes,
to pursue their interest in going for the new tranche of licenses, there were really very few stations on air. So when we were broadcasting on the Sundays, we had huge numbers of calls coming in, really surprising. And we had a good studio kit out, as everybody's involved in radio knows. You don't actually need to spend huge amounts of money to get very serviceable results.
And why was the decision made to stay on air? When everybody else was closed and the government said that the penalties had increased, there was a greater chance of raid. What was the thought process to say, right, listen, we're not going to go off, we're going to stay on?
No, well, we were young and
foolhardy.
Foolhardy, yeah, exactly. And as all young and foolhardy people do, we just push on regardless and enjoyed it. As we got a little bit older, then we went away from the live broadcasting into automated, and Premier, as an oldie station under automation, ran very successfully through the 90s, and we then decided it was time to go down the route of the temporary licenses, and got ourselves a temporary license for Dublin from BAI, and that was good fun. It was good fun to be able to do it with a larger transmitter power and with more in terms of equipment.
And with a license.
And with the license as well.
Took a little bit of the edge off it, probably.
No, well, I mean, there's also a satisfaction to proving that you can do it.
Right.
There's a lot of people who think that, going down the legal route is, easy peasy. But there are things that you have to do, and you have to do them right. And to do them right does take a certain amount of concentration. So we did Dublin, the first temporary license under Premier. And we then did the first multi-city station, where we did Dublin, Cork, Limerick and Galway under a temporary license. And nobody had attempted that before. And we did the connection over broadband. So there was a lot of experimentation to try and get good results. And it went well. So we did that for a while. And after that came Christmas FM.
Which still is on.
Which still, yes.
And will be going on again this year.
We have our application in, and
hopefully
all will go well, and we'll have another run at that.
Again, multi-city.
Again, multi-city with Christmas FM. We've Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway, and the southeast, and also Saggart covering the kind of Midland. Well, out of Dublin commuter route, Naas Kildare.
The Pale.
The Pale, indeed.
Just briefly take it back to
midnight on the 31st of December 88. What was the overriding feeling in the studio? You were on air live?
We were live for that. We felt that was something that
had to be done,
would be fun to do. And
as the countdown to the clock of midnight came, what was the overriding sense? Was it, yes, we've done it, or was it, what's next, or was it,
that was very much in the moment.
Was it?
Yeah, I mean, it was
full studio,
yeah, and really all up for it. And it was, after all, New Year's Eve, so there was a certain party atmosphere already in place. And
had you contingency plans in place for a raid?
No, we were not as organised as all that. I mean, there were certain things that the studio was in one building and the transmitter was in another building, so somebody turned up with a warrant with one address, they might get the transmitter, or if they turned up with the other address, they get the studio, but
you wouldn't get both.
Wouldn't necessarily get both. So,
what would you say is pirate radio's legacy, as in today's broadcasting?
I think the first thing is the pirate radio trained so many of the broadcasters that are in place today, and I think that having an entry point for people starting off is missing from radio today.
Which will affect in years to come, probably.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it around a lot of the stations, there are a lot of experienced broadcasters there, and they're all great broadcasters, and they've earned their stripes, and best of luck to them. But even they, I think, probably would acknowledge that looking downstream as to where the new talent is coming from is a question that has to be asked. I think also pirate stations, because there wasn't quite so much of a commercial imperative, were more diverse in the style of music that was played, and because they weren't forced to look
too
at these
formulaic.
things. Yeah, exactly.
Walter, it's been an absolute pleasure. I thank you very much. I hope Christmas FM gets their license, and we look forward to hearing you at Christmas.
Thanks very much, Ed. I'm looking forward to it myself.
Walter, thank you very much. Cheers.
Bye.
To a generation of listeners, the names of Radio Nova, Sunshine Radio and Treble TR have a special place in their hearts. The hobby, bedroom and part-time pirate radio stations of the 1960s and 70s were replaced in the 80s by high-powered, slick professional operations. A loophole in the antiquated law led to a broadcasting revolution when a former Radio Caroline DJ, Chris Carey, arrived in Dublin and in 1981 launched Radio Nova. Its clutter-free format and American-style programming was an instant success with the listeners. Despite its many ups and downs and Garda raids, the station dominated the lucrative ratings war in Dublin, therefore taking a large slice of the advertising revenue from RTE. Nova had departed the airways when the 1988 Wireless Telegraphy Act was introduced, but its station owner Chris Carey came back and applied for the national radio franchise, but lost out to the ill-fated Century Radio. For many thousands of viewers, my next guest is a stalwart of Ireland AM and TV3, Aidan Cooney. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be asked, by the way.
Absolutely. You're one of the people I really wanted to talk to when I came to this programme. Pirate radio, how did you get started?
I loved it. There was no pop radio in the 70s, and Radio Dublin appeared, and I was at home with flu listening to it in bed one day. My mother brought the radio upstairs. That's the times that were in it. And I was listening, and the signal drifted. It was 253 metres medium wave, it drifted. And I was tuning it in, and I found this thing called ARD, Alternative Radio Dublin, which was working out of Belvedere House with Don Moore, Dr. Don Moore, the late Dave Cunningham, Dave C, and Bernard Llewellyn on the station. And I listened to it, and I thought, that sounds different, it's my station. But I rang Radio Dublin and said I'd love to come out and see it. And they said, oh no, security's too tight here, we don't allow visitors. And I rang AOD after the flu and I said, can I come in and have a look? And they said, yeah, come on down. So I went down one evening and I was sat in with Ronan Collins, was on air when I got there. Sat in with Ronan, which was supposed to be just for 5 or 10 minutes, but I was a precocious little so-and-so. So I sat in with him for most of his show. Then Jason Main arrived to do his show. And I sat in with Jason Main for a while, and then I left. And as I was going down the stairs, I bumped into Dave Cunningham, or Dave C, and he asked me would I like to come in and answer the phones for him on a Friday evening. And I said, yeah, I'd love to. Then I had to go and ask my parents, could I get down there on the bus after school at 10 o'clock on a Friday night to answer phones? And amazingly, they said, yeah.
Even though knowing
yeah.
an illegal...
Yeah, that was the beginning of it.
Yeah.
And from then on in, they allowed me to practice during the summer holidays. They gave me a full-time job. They gave me access to a small studio to pretend I was an on-air DJ. And I got frustrated and I rang Cook and I said, I'm working for AOD and I'm not happy. And he just automatically assumed I was on air. He'd never checked. And he said, come on over, we'll give you a 12 to 2 on a Wednesday night. I thought, oh God, I'll never be allowed to do that. Again, managed to blag it with the folks. Turned it into a Saturday and Sunday, 8 to 10, when I was going back to school in September to do my leaving cert. And it went from there to Big D in 1980, to Radio Leinster, ended up doing a stint in Nova in 84, 85, then on to Sunshine. And I ended up doing various different stations. At Radio Annabelle, I was there for a while. I was kind of like a wanderer, and I couldn't get really a full-time gig with any of the stations because I'd kind of lost the way a little bit. And then Bob Gallagher rang me. God be good to him. Bob rang me out of the blue, and I was working in the Revenue Commissioners at the time, and the phone rings, and it's for me. And he said, do you fancy coming up and reading sports news? And I thought he was on the OQ 102. And I said, yeah, Bob, I'd love to. I said, when do you want me up there? And he's still in Mount Street. And he said, no, wait, it's treble TR. And I laughed. And he went, hey, you know, don't knock it, you come up and look at it. He said, at least come up and have a look. And I said, oh, well, I better do that. This is Bob. So I went up and had a look at the setup, but it wasn't bad. And Bill Maxwell was the station manager. Jimmy Smith was the owner. And they said, we'd like you to come up after work. We know you work, but we'd like you to read a sports bulletin at 5:30 and 6:30, and it'll be about 6 minutes long. You'll have to compile it. And I remember the biggest part of it was the racing results. And I thought, I'm not going to have time to compile. We have an idea. And they used to run in next door to the bookmaker shop, and the big chart on the wall, they'd rip it down, the paperboard, and I'd have that to read through. And I always remember thinking Treble TR didn't have an audience when I went up there. And I said, do I really want to be here? So I asked him for what at the time was an outrageous sum of money, I thought, for the job he was giving me. Monday to Friday reading 2 bulletins, and a Saturday afternoon reading the sports news. And they said to me, no problem. And you know where you go, oh, should have asked him for more. But that was where I spent the last year of pirate broadcasting as it was before they closed everybody down. And it was great.
Were you on air maybe?
Yeah, 88. And what happened with me in Treble TR, I didn't suspect it was going to happen, but Bill said to me afterwards, that was the plan from day one. Once they got me in the door, he had me filling in on some programmes. And then eventually they gave me drive time. And I remember saying to them, I don't know anything about country music. And they said to me, but you're going to learn. And some great tunes, some great artists I got to know, and it was just absolutely fantastic.
Cheap endies as well.
Yeah. So it was good. So I was there, finished up, it was New Year's Eve, and then we had a big hoolie in one of the clubs in town afterwards, one of the country and western clubs, and it was that was the end of the era.
What was the sense of feeling in the studio as it closed? Was it a sense of sadness?
It was a huge amount of sadness, because I mean, a lot of people had spent a lot of their lives. I mean, I had started out at 16, 15, I think even, and then here I was like in 1989, and I was 27. So the formative years of my life had been spent around studios, and I was working with the Revenue Commissioners. But at the same time, there was a hope. Hey, maybe I'll get a job in real radio when it comes. And yeah, that's what we were thinking. And then Jim Smith got the job of running Galway Bay FM. And he rang me and said, will you come down and do a show? We have drive time for you. And I said, yeah, I will. And I remember saying at home, I'm thinking of moving to Galway. And it was like, for what? You're leaving the civil service? Are you mad? And all this sort of stuff. But I got a career break out of the service. They were very good as well. And before I signed up with Jim, Today FM, or Century as it was then, came calling. Declan Meehan, who's a hero of mine, unashamedly say that, and a great broadcaster, one of the best we have in this country, he said, why don't you apply the stuff going? And I got breakfast weekends. But the money even then was quite good. So I was able to take my career break and work weekends there. Yeah.
And did you find the transition between pirate broadcasting and legal broadcasting huge?
It wasn't huge, because Chris Carey and Robbie Robinson, they brought a discipline with them. And I remember being in the Nova studio. I didn't work in Herbert Street. I worked up in the mountains. And I remember you went in and the idiot boards were there. And John Clark saying to me, God, Aidan, whatever you do, don't break the rules. There will be severe repercussions if he hears you. If he doesn't hear you, you might get away with it. And Chris was great, top man, great pair. Mad as a brush, or as daft as a brush. But there was never a dull moment when I was up there. It was great. Oh yeah.
Revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So in one sense,
could be taken from doing that.
Couldn't agree more with you. Yeah, and it was like that gave us discipline that we didn't have before that.
And you moved on into telly.
Yeah, that was what happened was Century had their A team. The A team that was there was quite strong Monday to Friday, and I got a call from a fellow called Jeff O'Brien, no relation to Dennis. He worked for Dennis, he was the programme director. And Andrew Hanlon, who was the head of news in the New 98, he had sort of said, give him a ring and see if he'll come in. And of course, I thought, this is great. I went down and I did an audition, and he said, gonna stop you there. And I thought, it's a bit strange. I'll offer you the job. And I said, well, I need a bit of time to think about it. He said, okay, go for a walk, come back and tell me you want the job, you don't want the job. He said, I can't wait. We're launching in a couple of weeks' time. So I said, okay, fine. I said, look, give me an hour or two. So I rang the bosses in Century, and they were very honest. Look, you're not going to make the A team. 18 months. I don't know, in fairness, he didn't say ever. Really pleased he didn't say that. That would have been awful. But he just said, you're not going to make it short term. I have a team there and we have a plan. So he said, what I would say to you is it's up to you to consider whether you stay and do weekends, but I would recommend if you've got full time, go full time. So I took that offer, and it moved from there, from being their sports editor to being their nighttime talk presenter to being their breakfast anchor with Debbie Allen, who's here with us now in Q. And then the TV came calling. And I said, no, I'm not working at a TV show. I'd never had any idea or any interest. And I got a call saying, come up and have a chat. So I went up and have a chat, and then I thought, I'll give it a go. And I went back to Dennis O'Brien, who was still obviously hands-on because he hadn't become the multi-billionaire he is now. Great guy, by the way. And he said, go with my blessing. He said, if it's to another radio station, you're not going, we'll double your money, we'll do whatever needs to keep you, but go. And he said to me, if it doesn't work out within the year, come back. Yeah, he said, I can't guarantee you have your breakfast show back. He said, you might be washing cars out the back, but we will take care of you. And that gave me the freedom. And it was just such a kind thing to do for somebody. Yeah, it was really wonderful. And if I just go back to the Pirate era, one of the good guys I worked for, a lot of good people there, a lot of people who helped out. The late Jim Kenny was always extremely kind to me. James Dillon was great, superb man to work for, with suave and sophisticated. Yeah, at Big D. Only he put me in a position, God, I never would have found myself in, and I think if the parents had found out, they probably would have pulled me out the door. The hunger strikes in '81, James had come back in and tried to reboot the station, and he'd moved the studios from the back of the cinema to plush studios upstairs over the cinema, and he built new sound desks, everything went in, it was great. And we were there on air one evening at drive time, and the studio door opened, and this guy, student type guy, walked in, no mask, no nothing, and I said, no, if you're here to collect a prize, you got to go down the corridor, door on the left. The next thing he showed me a pistol. And I was like, whoa, what's going on? I never even thought. He said, I have a tape here, and you're going to play the tape. He said, on behalf of the Republican movement or whatever, blah, 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 whatever bullshit they were using at the time. So he said, now I know that you can make this sound like it's on air in studio. Trust me, it's not worth your while to do that. This goes out in air or you will have a major problem. So I thought, okay, I'm not. Played it. And as we put it on, he stayed for about 30 seconds and then he vamoosed. And then we took it off and we apologised and went into a song. And the next thing, 2 armed detectives arrived from Kevin Street. And apparently there was a 257 and the Crofton got hit after that. Yes, so they were on a bit of a run and they knew, obviously they had insight into how you get in and how it operated. And that was probably one of the worst moments in all the years.
Worst moment, best moment then?
Oh, there's just been too many best moments. To get in the job in Radio Dublin, the Radio Dublin floats and the marches. Sure, I was 17, you didn't have an arse in your trousers, didn't have a care of the world. It was just...
Not known as Aidan Cooney either.
Oh, yeah, exactly, yeah, this Aidan J thing that they come up with, everyone had to have a DJ name. And some of the guys on air today still have the DJ name, as you know. But it was just great. Went off to Miami in '79 on the Radio Dublin holiday with Mike Eastwood, with John Everest, with Shea Byrne, with Barry Lang. You couldn't have asked for a better childhood.
No, and you still think about it, pirate radio.
Yeah.
Like, if you explain that to people outside the country,
no. But you know what? You look at the kids coming through all the colleges now doing media studies and media courses and the journalism courses. They're all very good. But we were very lucky. We got our training hands-on in a broadcast environment with people listening to us. You can't beat that. Can't beat that.
Aidan's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Eddie, thank you. Really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Radio Nova, the music's just begun. Radio Nova, Europe's #1. Radio Nova, the music's just begun. Radio Nova, Europe's #1.